Oh, goody, goody, here it comes.
Welcome to the Cinema Psycho Show.
You are interested in the unknown, the mysterious, the unexplainable. That is why you are here.
Oh, my God, don't stop now!
With your hosts, Brian, John, and Elaine.
Welcome to the Cinema Psycho Show, the madhouse for film freaks and film fans of all types. I'm your host, Brian Conton. You'll notice that I'm not joined by my fellow co-hosts, John and Elaine Wilscroft. It's just me today, and we have another one of our exclusive interviews that John did as our main episode for today. So this is episode 118, and it's an interview with someone who literally wrote the book on slasher films. So this is coming right off the heels of Halloween. And if you're really in the mood for horror movies, this episode is really for you to give you kind of the insight into the slasher genre, more so than just what we went over. So John was able to get a hold of author, screenwriter, and producer Adam Rockoff. Adam is known primarily for writing some screenplays such as I Spit on Your Grave, the 2010, but he is really well known for his two books, Going to Pieces, which eventually was turned into a documentary called Going to Pieces, and The Horror of It All. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John. This is an interview with Adam Rockoff.
Do you like the solar system?
Yeah, it's quite cool, planets and stuff.
And hello, everybody. This is John with the Cinema Psycho Show, doing another one of our video extras. And I'm pleased to say we have a true expert in the field of slasher movies. I actually have my copy book here, cheap plug. I suggest buying this. Let me actually frame it so it's on the screen here. Going to Pieces is one of his books, Adam Rockoff. Now, I could, give a little bit of a brief description of you, but I have you here, so I will turn it away and let you go ahead.
Good. So first of all, thanks for having me. I always enjoy talking about slasher films, obviously. I wouldn't have written the book on them because it certainly wasn't for the money. Like most people who are probably watching this, I was such a huge fan of these films growing up. I'm in my mid-40s now, so this was obviously before the internet. And the only place you could see these films was at either your local video store. You could rent them on VHS, or you could see them on cable TV. And, I just devoured them. I loved them. And as I grew up, I realized, there was some scholarship about them, but there was never a book that really told the whole story about these films. Not from sort of an analytical perspective, but really from a history of them, about the people who made them, how they made them, why they made them, things like that. So, I figured I might as well be the first one. And the book is now almost 20 years old. And when I look back on it, a lot of it, I cringe because I was basically just a kid when I wrote it. But, I am proud of the fact that it was sort of the first quasi-critical study in history of these films.
Yeah. Now, every genre has its subgenres, but just to kind of start broad here, how would you define a slasher film, and what makes a film, like in the horror genre, a slasher?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess the technical or clinical definition of it is, the slasher film is a subset of the horror genre that a group of films that shares a bunch of formal and stylistic characteristics. And, these characteristics are the ones that, all of us are familiar with now. The final girl, which is sort of the headstrong lone female who survives the killer's onslaught to either kill the killer or escape. There's the past event, which really is, what precipitates all of this, something that happened to the killer as a child or a young adult, which is why he's seeking revenge in the present. There's the stylistic point of view camera shot, the stalking camera shot from the eyes of the killer. All of those different characteristics. And then maybe most important of all is just, hence the name, slasher films. The victims in these films are usually cut up, slashed by some sharp object, whether it's a knife, which is typical, but it could be, an axe, a hatchet, anything with a sharp blade. And it sounds so silly and so reductive to define a whole subgenre just by the method by which the characters are killed, but in some ways, that's true.
Now, I had mentioned in the episode that we just put out that, in my opinion, and I'm sure everybody has one that is like the pure definition of it, but I always thought Prom Night was the, if you put it in the dictionary, slasher film as a picture, I imagine Prom Night hits all those, things you just mentioned. Do you think that's kind of the pinnacle slasher, or, do you have one in particular, or is it a couple?
It's certainly not my favorite, but if we're talking about which of the slasher films sort of stays closest to that paradigm or to that formula, yeah, Prom Night is as good as any. Terror Train is, as good as any. My Bloody Valentine is as good as any. Ironically, Friday the 13th, which a lot of people would say, really... Besides Halloween, Friday the 13th is the quintessential slasher film. That one actually deviates in a lot of ways from the typical paradigm. Meaning, the killer, in later installments, obviously, is Jason. But in the first one, the killer's a woman. It's, Mrs. Voorhees. And then there's, a lot of other ways that it differs as well. But Prom Night, that's certainly a good one.
Just check my questions here. My phone went down. Now, would you say that the trend really started with Halloween? I mean, obviously there was Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Last House on the Left and, examples beforehand. But would you say that in terms of this being a huge meteoric rise of popularity, did that all start with Halloween?
Yes. I would make the argument that, it did start with Halloween. I mean, if you want to go back a little historically, you could say Psycho is really the great-granddaddy of the slasher film. But that was sort of fantastic film, brilliant film, but it was sort of singular. When Psycho came out, people passed out, they didn't take showers ever again, but it didn't spawn a whole series of similar films, except by William Castle and his mini Hitchcocks. But it didn't, the slasher film didn't sort of come right after Psycho. You could make the argument, actually, that even before Halloween, that it was Black Christmas, because Black Christmas, as much as Halloween did, that really stays pretty close to what we think of as the typical slasher formula today. The only problem with that is Black Christmas, which, many people would say, myself included, I guess technically or artistically is as good a film, if not better than Halloween and Friday the 13th. It was a small Canadian film, provincial film in some way. And when it came out, it did not have anywhere near the societal impact as Halloween had, and even more like Friday the 13th had. So that's why, when you talk about the antecedents, stylistically, it certainly is one. But if it hadn't been for Halloween, and then if it hadn't been for Friday the 13th after that, we'd have no Prom Night, no Terror Train, no Happy Birthday to Me, no Burning. So it didn't really come from Black Christmas, as amazing as a film as that is.
So what was it about Halloween? When you have Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you have Black Christmas, you have all these examples that could have sparked this. What was it about Halloween that, that it was successful and they, all these studios were like, let's make 1 million of them a year,
A perfect storm. So there's two ways to answer your question. The first way is what made it successful to the audience, and that were again a perfect storm of characteristics of the film. It had this iconic villain who had this, blank, expressionless face that became iconic. It had a fantastic final girl in Jamie Lee Curtis. But besides Jamie Lee Curtis, it also had, secondary characters which were likable, identifiable. It was set not in sort of, an uncommon location. It was set in suburbia, and everybody, besides city kids, everybody at the time, was growing up in suburbia. They could identify with the location. It had a great protagonist or antagonist in, Loomis. Donald Pleasance was, fantastic. So it was all these things that sort of came together and crystallized together to make the film what it was. But the second part of your question was about, why was it Halloween that spawned this? It made, at the time was the most successful independent film ever made, and that's why fellow producers took note. I mean, if it did a fraction of what it made, I mean, people weren't going to look at it and say, this is a brilliantly well-made film. John Carpenter's a fantastic director. Look at his artistry. Look how he moves the camera. Let's mimic him. No, it was only because it was so successful financially that people followed in his footsteps and tried to, mimic what he did and duplicate the formula.
Yeah, and absolutely they did, with starts, 79 through, I mean, I guess they didn't technically ever stop. Your book kind of marks the heyday is 86,
Right. Which is an totally arbitrary date. I picked, I don't even know why I picked 86. But, and it's funny, when I started doing the book, that in the late 90s, that was when the resurgence of these slasher films was Scream, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, and Urban Legend, and Valentine, all of them were actually coming back. But yeah, look, you could pick any date from, 84, 85, all the way up to, 90, 91, 92, when you want to end it. But the heyday, without a doubt, was, 78 to around 83, 84.
Yeah. Well, I always, thought that the end of the true golden era kind of came with Silent Night, Deadly Night, and all the family, first protesters of that film. And, because that was, there had been Santa Claus slashers before that, or holiday, even just holiday ones as well. But the advertising on that just got people up in arms. And I think that, kind of marked the end of the true golden era. And that was about 84, I believe. Now, what are your...
It was 84. It actually, and I should know this because I wrote about it in the book. I think it came out, if I'm not mistaken, the same exact day in November of 84 as Nightmare on Elm Street did. Yep. And if not the same exact day, literally, within a few weeks of it. So, yeah, and, it's funny, you mentioned the Christmas slashers, and I love Silent Night, Deadly Night. In fact, I loved it so much that I was fortunate enough to write the liner notes for the early DVD, the Anchor Bay release of it. But as much as I enjoyed it, there are a handful of other Christmas slashers. We talked about Black Christmas before. There was, To All a Good Night, Silent Night, Bloody Night, Don't Open Till Christmas, Christmas Evil. I mean, there were a ton of them that came out before that certainly didn't cause the same sort of outrage. And the reason for that, quite frankly, was probably because nobody saw them. And Silent Night, Deadly Night was the first one that had, I think it was TriStar or Trimark, who released it in the States. And it had, a fairly, well-funded advertising campaign behind it. I mean, it was, the one sheet was in newspapers, the trailer ran on TV, so, and that's what attracted the attention of, these people who, we look back and it was such a quaint, funny time, but when it was happening, parents were upset. No question about it.
And it's funny to think how that would have, kind of split the audience. And if there hadn't been those protests, Silent Night, Deadly Night could have been the extremely successful movie. And now they did spawn a bunch of sequels, but it, could have been looked on the way Nightmare on Elm Street is now, where if it, but because that movie, I think, got shuffled off to the side, audiences didn't have to really pick. They just went to Nightmare on Elm Street, and the rest is history for Freddy and New Line Cinema.
Right. I mean, look, you're right, but I think we do have to give credit where credit is due. And, I think no matter how you look at it, Nightmare on Elm Street is just a far superior film to Silent Night, Deadly Night. So, I mean, yeah. When people ask, as a horror fan, when people ask you, what your favorite horror movie is, I always say mine, changes by the day, as much as you change your underwear. But there's always a few that are right at the top, and Nightmare on Elm Street, for my money, is, always in the top 5. And maybe it was because when I saw it for the first time, I was, I guess, 10 years old. When you see, whatever you see in your formative years are the ones that really stick with you, and that, terrified me, impacted me more than almost anyone has.
Yeah, I think that's why, Halloween was in terms of the slasher genre, and not just that, but horror movies too. Halloween was really for me, so I think that's kind of why I've held on to that. Now, slasher films are often derided, from a critic point of view, especially, Siskel and Ebert, where, probably the most famous critics of the time, they did not hold back on their disliking in these movies. Why do you think that this that was the case, and what can we pull away like in a positive sense from these movies?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer why critics didn't like them is because of the violence and the bloodshed and the theory that they, exploited women more than men. I mean, there's a fantastic book called Blood Money, which I actually wrote a bit about by a great author, much better author than me. He's an academic, and he did this study, and he sort of tears down all the preconceived notions we have about slasher films, about how they focus more on women victims, they wallow in their suffering, all that kind of stuff that I never subscribed to in the first place. But sorry, I went off on a tangent a little bit, but I mean, the truth is, a lot of these films, the acting's terrible, the scripts are terrible, the plots are ridiculous, a lot of the same reasons why we love them. But objectively, from sort of a mainstream critic perspective, that's why critics aren't fans. Now, you said, what can you take away? I think if we look at these now, almost 40 years later, and really study them, many of them from first-time directors, I mean, some of them are really well-made, extraordinary films. I mean, everybody says, Black Christmas, Halloween, we know how brilliant those films are. But I mean, for example, I watched He Knows You're Alone. Sort of a throwaway slasher from the early 80s. I mean, fans know of it, hardcore fans like it, but I mean, nobody really still talks about He Knows You're Alone. But watching it again, it's astounding what a well-made film it is, and what a firm grasp that the director, Armin Mastroianni, has on the cinematic medium, and how talented a director he is. So, I mean, if you made He Knows You're Alone a drama, as opposed to a psychological thriller, as opposed to a straight-up horror film, he would have gotten a ton more notoriety and accolades than he did, because I think critics are unwilling to look past the subject matter and really, appreciate the talent of these young directors at the time.
And would it be fair to say, in terms of slasher movies, not that horror movies hadn't gone this route before, but they were more based on the fear of the unknown, but these films dealt directly with attacking people, just, tons of gore and just straight up murder, where Rosemary's Baby was obviously, a completely different type of film than, say, a Halloween, where people were being gutted up. And so where the critics I always felt it was kind of a philosophical issue more than just, the movies weren't all that great, especially with Siskel and Ebert, where they didn't like, I don't think, the attacking of teenagers and the straight up, murder of that kind of.
Yeah, I completely agree. However, look, there's no question that movies like Friday the 13th and everything that followed in its wake, The Burning, Terror Train, Prom Night, they were obviously more violent and graphic than a movie like, Rosemary's Baby. Fantastic movie, but, a slow, psychological, classic, quote-unquote horror film. But, I mean, there are examples like Last House on the Left, as brutal as a film, maybe that has ever been made. And, Ebert gave that a good review. The Exorcist, I mean, again, it's a little quaint today, but I mean, 1974, you had a preteen girl shoving a crucifix into her vagina. I mean, that's hardcore, heavy, disturbing stuff. And the critics, went crazy over that. So I don't think it's just a question of all the violence. I think it's a question of the graphic violence in the slasher films sort of within the context of what the critics saw as, these flimsy, throwaway, unserious plots. Because you have to look, again, I love The Exorcist, I love Rosemary's Baby, and I love Friday the 13th and Halloween. But The Exorcist is a heavier, deeper film than Friday the 13th. I mean, questions of, faith and loss of faith and, child possession and that stuff is, serious stuff. It's not just teenagers going to a summer camp, skinny dipping, getting high, and, fooling around.
Got it. Yeah. Well, speaking of which, what are some of the highs, and I know we've discussed a couple now, and some of the lows of the genre?
Yeah, well, the highs, unlike other, I guess, art forms, like, I mean, popular music definitely comes to mind, where sort of the most successful pop songs in history probably aren't the best. I have to say, in terms of the slasher films, the best ones are probably the most well-known. I mean, you have the big three, Friday the 13th, Halloween, and Nightmare on Elm Street. By far the most popular, and it's not just me saying that. For example, I went to get coffee this morning at 7-Eleven, which is literally half a mile from my house, and this is again almost 40 years after. All of them, they still had on the counter. They had plush toys of Freddy, Michael Myers, and Jason. I mean, whoever would have thought when these films came out that they would have that kind of longevity? So those three are obviously among the top, but then there's the second tier, and these are ones we mentioned before, too, like Prom Night, Terror Train, The Burning, Night School, My Bloody Valentine, Happy Birthday to Me. All those are fantastic, too. Some of the lesser-known ones that I think hold up as well as any of them, I mean, I have a soft spot for April Fool's Day. I love it.
Yes.
Just love it. I mean, I know a lot of horror fans don't because they think it was sort of a scam, and they had the wool pulled out from under them because the whole, spoiler alert, everybody, if you haven't seen it. The whole thing is, a gag. None of it is true, but, I've always loved that film. I watch it maybe, a couple of times a year, and it holds up wonderfully. In terms of Sweet 16 is actually another one I was thinking about. Nobody talks about Sweet 16. A lot of people haven't even seen it. I mean, part of that is because it didn't get really a big national release, and also because it never had a major DVD release. But that's another really good one that sort of holds close to the traditional slasher formula. In terms of the worst, I would say, and I've written this before, I'm not just thinking off the top of my head, the three worst, Home Sweet Home, which is actually a Thanksgiving slasher.
I've seen that.
New Year's Evil, which is a New Year's Eve themed slasher, and the worst of them all, Don't Go Into the Woods, also known as Don't Go Into the Woods Alone. Just all of them, I mean, for camp value, I guess they're entertaining, but I remember seeing them for the first time, I was angry at how bad they were and how much of a waste of time it was.
Gotcha. Now, obviously, a lot of these movies came out in the Reagan era, and there was a rush of conservatism, and with that comes a little bit of censorship, and that kind of thing, of that nature. What can we pull away from these films? Did they have anything to say about the time that they were made, or is it just simply Halloween made a bunch of money? Let's just do that again with a different mask and higher body count?
I think that's 100% it. And at risk of sounding sort of anti-intellectual, and I've written 2 books about horror films, and if you look at the reviews of them, which I try not to do, but every writer does, a lot of criticisms about my writing, and there's plenty, believe me, is about how sort of unanalytical I am, and how I just discount the prevalent psychoanalytic theories and social theories about these films. One of the sort of, I guess, well-known theories about Halloween is that, Michael Myers reflects the repression of the characters. It's the return of the repressed, as some critics have said. Well, that's not what it is, because nowhere in the film does it demonstrate that, and John Carpenter has even said, that's not what I intended. I intended him to be this faceless force of nature killing machine. So if you're reading that into the film, that's fine, but it's your opinion. It's not the intent of the filmmakers. And, same with Friday the 13th. I've, heard people talk about, you mentioned Reagan before, how these films were sort of perfect for their error. It was almost as if Jason was some sort of conservative, firebrand avenging angel, killing all these, terrible teenagers who are doing drugs and having sex. And again, that's a great way of looking at it. But one, Sean Cunningham never meant to do that for 1 second. The thought never even occurred to him. He just wanted to make a buck on a pot boiler, as he likes to call it. And the second thing is, most of these films, the best of them, were conceived, and a lot of them even made, before anybody, even knew who Reagan was. They were, made in the Carter administration, or before Reagan was inaugurated. So to really say they were a reflection of the times, I've never subscribed to that. But again, full disclosure, I'm in the minority. A lot of horror critics and fans fans really look back and they do read into these films stuff that, I just don't subscribe to.
Well, because so many different groups, derided these films, and critics and, and quote unquote intellectuals, was it a matter of kind of rebellion for kids to kind of go see these movies? Was that kind of part of it? Like, this is, we're not supposed to see these, and these are what the adults don't like. And so, let's go see the Friday 13th part 35 and just, go from there.
Absolutely. That's one huge part of it, maybe the main part. That was certainly part of it for me. The illicit thrill of it. If these were things that were, I don't want to say promoted, because what kind of parent promotes them to these films to their kids when you're that young? But if there was nothing sort of illicit about these films, there's no question they wouldn't have had the same allure. And it wasn't just the violence and the horror; it was the sexuality too. Part of it was the violence, but I'll be honest, I was horny little teenager, and knowing that, and there was no internet with pornography, a click away, if you wanted to see naked girls, or naked boys, you either got dirty magazines, if you could get your hand on them, or you stayed up till 2-3 in the morning to watch, the softcore stuff on Cinemax, or you went to see mainstream horror movies where there was a little bit of TNA.
And also, I do feel that this is one of the first genres to really have explicitly teenagers. Now, they were played by 26, 27-year-olds, but teenagers as the main characters. And they were being rebellious in the movie. They were smoking pot and drinking beer. And, would you say this is one of the first times that, teenagers kind of saw themselves reflected on film?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say the first, because, just being sort of a semi-student of film, right. Corman did it in the 1950s with the beach films, that's probably what sort of professional critics would say was the first time that Hollywood capitalized on the teen audience. But your point is a sound one. That there's no question that these films did so well in part because the audiences saw themselves reflected in the characters. And actually, I was mentioning He Knows You're Alone before, and excuse me, I was thinking to myself, I was wondering, why did this film do as well as the other ones? It's definitely as well made. It's as terrifying. It's as compelling. And one of the answers is, it's not about teenagers. It's about young adults who are getting married. These characters were, a lot older than, the 16, 18-year-old kids that were, in at Camp Crystal Lake and in Haddonfield, and in Springwood. So, yeah, the point that the audience is identified with these characters, there's no question that was a major part of the appeal of these films.
Gotcha. Now, was there as much of a demand for as many of these movies that were made at that time, or was it just a matter of, every studio wanted to make as many as they could during its height of its popularity, and they were easy to make. So, 5 or 6 would come out from each studio a year. Was there as much of a demand for them, or was it just a matter of every studio capturing them as quick as they can?
You can't separate them. The answer is yes and yes. Studios made them because there was a demand for them, and because there was a demand for them, studios continued to make them. Now, when the slasher film declined in, the mid to late 80s, again, it was, audiences lost interest, and because they lost interest, studios decided not to make as much. I have to say, meaning as horror fans, we look back at these films with, a sense of love and reverence. But when they were coming out at the time, the people who were making them certainly didn't share that, opinion. Not that the directors and the writers didn't work hard, because they did. They cared about the product. But a lot of them, admittedly, they've said this. They made horror films because they were cheap and easy to do. A lot of the actors and actresses, they didn't really want to be in a horror film. They would have just as, they would have been in a comedy, and they would have loved to have been in a serious drama. They did it because this is what they were hired to do. And the distributors and the studios, they hated these films, hated them. Frank Mancuso at Paramount, but they felt that, they had a responsibility to their shareholders and to, the company themselves to go where the money was. And at the time, these films were unbelievably cheap to make, and they were unbelievably lucrative. And every studio, got into the game.
And it's amazing to think, how derided these films were by critics. They launched so many careers: Johnny Depp, Lawrence Fishburne, Kevin Bacon, all these people that got their start in these movies, and maybe without these opportunities, they wouldn't be household names they are today.
No, but I mean, even George Clooney, he was in, Return to Horror High, which, is not a favorite of mine. So, but it's, I think that came out like in the late 80s. I mean, besides the ones you mentioned, which are, the well-known ones, there's dozens and dozens of famous actors and actresses who really got their start with these films.
Let's see here. So what do you think killed the slasher subgenre? And as we pointed out at the top of this recording, I mean, they didn't stop. I mean, they're still being made to this day. They didn't just go away. But, obviously the big meteoric rise fizzled out. What do you think caused, the end of that to occur?
What I think actually is, again, contrary to what most, I guess, critics or students of the slasher film think, I think the common thought is that people lost interest and studios stopped making these films because it was just the same old, that the formula didn't adapt. People got tired of seeing the same story over and over again. And I totally disagree, because the films that I love the most in the slasher genre, I mean, are ones that really are so similar to each other and stay as close to the formula as they possibly can. I mean, Friday the 13th series, which is probably my favorite slasher series, I mean, the first 4, and you could even make the argument 5, 6, and 7 films, it's basically the same film. And that's what I liked about it. It was when Jason went to Manhattan and when he went to hell. I mean, that's what I didn't like. That was crazy. I mean, Part 10, which people sort of look back now and say, or Jason X, Jason in space, how different that was and exciting. It wasn't exciting to me. I didn't want to see him on a spaceship. I thought that was stupid. I wanted to see him in Crystal Lake, killing people. Same thing with Nightmare on Elm Street. I would have been happy if they would have done, Nightmare 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all, on that one suburban street. But they got cute with it. Freddy died, he blew up. It was in 3D. Then the Meta New Nightmare, which everybody loved. But, there was something comforting about these films. Why? I don't know. But I liked the formula. It was like, the Western. Everybody, fans of the Western generally like the Western because you know what the archetypes are. You know what you're getting when you go in. And that's what I felt with slasher films. And, as they went along and people tried to do too much with them, that's where I thought they lost its way.
And speaking of meta-ness, I do find it interesting that by 96, the slasher was kind of dead, to a certain degree. And then out comes Scream, which is kind of this meta autopsy of the whole genre. And the irony of it is that it kind of rewoke the genre that it was almost playfully mocking, and then in its examination, it brought the body back to life by accident, Then you got all these new wave of urban legend and all those movies in the 90s.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, again, I'm in the minority here. I don't love Scream. When it came out, it annoyed. Look, I am grateful to it for what it did because it really did jumpstart the genre, not just the slasher genre, the horror genre as a whole, which before Scream was, completely moribund. It was, just dead. I mean, dead and buried. No pun intended. And then Scream came and gave it, a shot of life. But just for my money, I loved urban legend. I liked Valentine even, by the same director, Jimmy Blank. So I thought, and still think is a fantastic director. I Know What You Did Last Summer. I liked Scream. I thought it was just, I appreciated it, but I thought it was sort of, too cool for itself. It was looking at the audience. And as you said, it was very meta, and that's fine. But I really think the truth is the reason that Scream did well is not because it winked at the audience. It's not because it knowingly, smiled and, yeah, you're in on the joke. It's because it had a great killer with a very cool mask. It had, a young cast. It was the same exact reason that it did well, that movies like Friday the 13th and Terror Train and Prom Night did well. Same exact reason. That's why that generation flocked to see Scream, not because somebody was, winking at them and telling them how smart they were.
Yeah. Hear that? A quick note to shout out to our other co-host, Brian Connington. See, Adam doesn't like Scream as like you don't. So, hey, there you go, Brian. When you watch this. Yeah.
Why doesn't he like it, by the way?
The thing is, we've done, I think, 115 episodes now, and I'm sure he's going to comment on this right away and put me right. I don't think we've ever gotten the same answer twice. Now, I don't think he liked that it mainstreamed horror films as much as it did, and there was almost even when these like slasher movies were coming on, they're extremely popular. They were still kind of the independent filmmakers kind of thing. And you had a very select audience, like they were our films. And I think that, then, as he said during the episode, he saw Dawson's Creek actors in horror movies. And all of a sudden to him, it was, it was kind of being taken away from the independent horror fan into something a little more plastic, I guess.
Yeah, I actually never thought of that, but I think he's absolutely right. There's no question that when Scream came out, and it might have been just a function of the times, I don't know, but it was a much more mainstream movie than, even the mainstream ones like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, you had, I don't know if this is true, but I could say, like, my parents probably knew about, Scream when it came out. But back then, my grandmother wouldn't have known who Michael Myers was or who Jason Voorhees was. It was, you're right. They were still a little bit more, this is our kind of thing under the radar.
Yeah. Well, Brian, let me know if I'm right or wrong. All right. And, just kind of to wrap things up a little bit, what do you think the legacy of the slasher genre is? I know it's a little broad, but just,
This is such a stupid answer. But I think it's accurate, and I'm not trying to be funny. Its legacy is its legacy, and what I mean by that is still, 40 years later, 35 years later, I go into 7-Eleven, and these characters, the villains in these films are, plush toys. I have two kids. One's in high school now, and one's in junior high. But, just a few years ago, when they were in elementary school, I would go to their Halloween parade and still see Freddy Krueger. The biggest news in the last few days in the horror community is, Victor Miller's lawsuit against Paramount and Sean Cunningham for the rights to remake Friday the 13th. If you would have told Sean Cunningham in 1980 that this was going to be a problem, he would have laughed, until he died. Nobody would have even guessed. And then, what's the biggest upcoming horror film, in the next few weeks? Halloween. I mean, the remake. I mean, these films have, not only have they not died and been forgotten about, but they've been remembered, revitalized by fans who are my age, and been embraced by a whole nother generation. Me and a buddy who I always go see the horror films with, when we went to see Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th in the theaters, it wasn't, old farts like us who loved the originals. It was all young kids, and that's it's exciting in some ways. I mean, the people who I talk to these films about are my age. But, without the new generation, the new blood, no pun intended, these films will die out. But because that's not happening, I think it's, there's reason to be optimistic about the genre. Not just in the foreseeable future, but, for generations to come, hopefully.
Yeah, I wonder if when she's 80, we're going to see another Halloween where, 60 years after, she's Michael Myers has a walker and he's just still coming after her. Yeah, it's incredible to think. I talked to the guy who played Michael when he was unmasked, and he said, I thought it would play in 2 drive-in movie theaters and then it would be forgotten forever. And here we are, 40 years later, and it's as big as ever. any high hopes for the new Halloween? Think it's going to be good?
I think it's going to be fantastic. I mean, look, everything I've heard and everything I've read, and I try not to read a lot because I want to go into it just as a fan and enjoy it. But the trailer looks great, and every writer who whose opinion I respect and admire and who's seen it thus far has said it's fantastic. And one of the producers is Ryan Turek, who works for Blumhouse, who used to be a well-known horror writer who sort of crossed over into making films. He's one of the producers on it. He's been plugging it, and he has fantastic taste. So yeah, I mean, just very excited and very optimistic.
Anything that you have coming up or anything you want to plug? I mean, obviously you don't have to, but I mean, I wanted to give you the opportunity to get some, little something out there.
Look, I'm not above plugging my own stuff. Right now, not too many horror projects. I've been writing a ton of women in peril thrillers for Lifetime. Almost doing that full time exclusively. They're fun. I enjoy them. Audiences seem to like them, but horror's in my blood. So it's not going away anytime soon. I'm still pounding on doors trying to get people to read my horror scripts. So hopefully in the not too distant future, I'll be able to have some hardcore horror projects coming out. But sorry, I'm poking at you. Just something came up on screen. But yeah, for right now, I'm mainly doing the TV thrillers.
All right. Well, I will put the book and this one especially, but your other works into the description of this. Every artist is their own worst critic, and you are a little hard on yourself. But I would say that if you love horror movies and slasher movies, pick up this book. It's why I reached out to him. It's an awesome read. It's unbelievably detailed. If you like the genre, so Going to Pieces, check that book out. You can find it on Amazon or anywhere else. I just want to thank you again for giving me your time and being willing to come on and just talk about slashers movies with me, because that was the greatest 45 minutes of my life. I get to talk about movies with somebody that knows this genre as much as I do. So thank you again for your time, and I guess we'll be seeing you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's look. I mean, there's nothing I like more than talking about slasher films, so I appreciate it. And who's ever listening, thank you for listening.
Be sure to like us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google+, at Psycho Show. You can also find us on the Epicast Network at epicastnetwork.com. If you have a favorite movie or question you want to throw away, you can contact us at cinemapsychoshow.com. And make sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and iTunes and catch a new episode available every Sunday.
Epicast.